Hi, this is Mira Salva at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Global Journalism Seminar. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. We have today one of the most important speakers of the series, the Burmese-American journalist Min Thant, who has covered business, politics and conflict in Myanmar, Thailand and the United States. They won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for their part in covering the Rohingya crisis and its aftermath with the Reuters team. In February this year, Myanmar went through yet another crisis. A coup deposed Aung San Suu Kyi, and the military has used lethal force to crack down on dissent. The civilian death toll has climbed to at least 815 people, and at least 4,000 people are in detention, including 60 journalists, according to a local monitoring group. On Monday, Frontier's managing editor Danny Fenster was detained at Yangon International Airport shortly before he was due to board a flight to Kuala Lumpur, and we believe he's being held at the insane prison in Yangon. Some of the international media efforts to cover this story are having a damaging impact on the region, and this is something we want to discuss today in the context of diversity, narratives, who gets to tell these stories, and who the audiences are, and what we expect from both the journalism and the journalists covering these today. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for that very kind introduction. So before we get into the sort of main topic, I wanted to ask the audience here to indulge me in a bit of a thought experiment. I know that quite a large number of the audience are journalists or people who are sort of invested in news media as a field. So yeah, I would like to ask you to imagine that you are a reporter with a very specific beat. Maybe you're a tech reporter or a business reporter, or you specialize in, something else. And, one day you have your editor come and ask you to cover a midterm election because your colleague, who is normally a political correspondent, is from the city that's having the election, and your editor tells you that it might be better if you cover it because you would have a more objective voice and lend a valuable outsider perspective. And I think in that situation, I imagine most of us would be quite confused by such a request and perhaps even offended on behalf of our colleague at the insinuation that somehow their expertise and experience that would generally make them more capable of covering such a story makes them less qualified. And yet, this is exactly what we see when we have these sort of parachute journalists come into countries like Myanmar, and that's the narrative that we're often told. We have institutions, often at great financial expense, sending people who are not experts in the country, sometimes not even the region, and ask them to do reporting on a country that they may only know through the original reporting of local journalists, the very journalists that they've been brought in to speak over. And I think, if we frame it like that, because when we talk about countries like Myanmar, countries in the global South, it's very easy to get into this mindset of what is normal, what is quite traditional. But if we kind of reframe the narrative and think about Myanmar just like any other country that is in the global North, in the Western world, it becomes this very strange thing to think about objectivity and a lack of bias being coupled with ignorance rather than deep experience and deep knowledge of a place. So I think today I want to talk a little bit about how parachute journalism differs or doesn't from the foreign correspondence model, the impact of the practice of both foreign correspondence and parachute journalism, and talk a little bit about what we can do about this going forward. So I think first I want to differentiate parachute journalists from foreign correspondents generally. It's a very sort of derogatory term. It's a slightly newer term. And I would like to clarify right off the bat that, not every foreign correspondent is a parachute journalist, but those of us who have the privilege, whether that is because of our passport or because of other kind of societal privileges to travel around the world and become foreign correspondents, we all have the potential in us to become a parachute journalist. And in the case of Myanmar, and in the now sort of infamous case of the CNN trip, I think it's a really good case study to look at what parachute journalism looks like and the sort of harm it can do. So for those who are not familiar, the CNN team went into Myanmar about 2 months ago for a short reporting trip that resulted in a few news pieces that provided relatively few new information about the situation in Myanmar, but simultaneously resulted in the arrest of 11 people by a regime that, as was said earlier, has killed over 800 people. And we know that 8 of those people have been released, but we don't know what happened to the last 3. We don't know if they're still being detained. We don't know if they're alive. And even the ones who were released are now on the radar of a regime that, has shown itself to be quite willing to go after even family members of people who are resisting against them. And, I think in the case of CNN, what made it very clear that this was parachute journalism was the fact that the trip and her report was repeatedly framed as Clarissa Ward, the reporter, being the first foreign reporter to be allowed in Myanmar since the beginning of the coup. And it was never really made clear what these qualities, being first and being foreign, added to the reporting on Myanmar. And instead, the arrest of the Myanmar people who spoke to these reporters as a result of the trip really played out in a way that highlights the danger of parachute journalists who, who are not adding to the discourse, to the knowledge about the country, and really have nothing more to offer than being first and to being foreign. And journalists in Myanmar, both foreign and local, have been managed to report on this coup for months now without instigating these sorts of mass arrests at public spaces due to our presence, and have been able to do sort of investigative pieces as well that, can be quite dangerous in the way that they unveil these sorts of hidden networks of power and prestige that really undergird the way in which the military maintains power in the country. And I would argue that had this trip been attended by journalists who better understood the Myanmar context and better knew how to report in Myanmar, we might not be here talking about this. And CNN kind of created the situation in a couple different ways. Firstly, they advertised that they were going on this trip before they arrived, and that really created a public panic among citizens in Myanmar about the potential of CNN covering the coup in a way that legitimized the military junta. People heard that CNN was coming at the invitation of the junta, and you saw all sorts of comics, you saw memes, you saw posts really stressing that people need to make sure that CNN understands the truth and they don't get tricked by the junta. And, this is a population of people that for 60, 70 years have largely only had access to state-run media. And it was only in the last 10 years really that they experienced a life in which independent media was freely accessible, and even then it was quite controlled. As we can see from the arrests of journalists even before the coup began. And then secondly, CNN created or made the situation even worse by asking their military minders to depart from the original plans, where the reporters were meant to only interact with the military and members of the military council, and to be taken to a public space. And given the context of fear that was already created, even if CNN was telling people, and you can see them on camera doing this, they were telling people, this might be risky for you. Are you sure you want to talk to us? That situation had already been created. And by placing themselves in a place where they were accessible to the public, they essentially created an inevitable situation where the public were going to talk to them, and were going to risk, everything in the case of some people, in order to make sure that the thing they feared the most, that the junta will be legitimized through the reporting of a really well-respected global news institution, would be realized. And like, we can argue that CNN is not responsible for the actions of the military, and that's true, and that the people who spoke to them were adults who were making choices. But I would argue that a lot of this would have been avoidable as well if CNN had sent someone who was perhaps more familiar with either the region or Myanmar, or continue the sort of reporting they were doing before Clarissa Ward got there. The CNN team had been putting out, the CNN Asia team had been putting out quite a lot of content on Myanmar up to that point. And, I think it's very interesting that the sort of coverage that became hyped and became sort of this selling point for the network was having this outsider come in who was going to educate the rest of the world about it, as opposed to this team of longtime experts that they had already had in Asia continue to have the coverage, or to give platform to someone from that team. And I'm going to be a bit annoying and quote myself, but I wrote in an article in April about the CNN trip that to have a lack of experience counted as a marker of neutrality and objectivity, and not as a disqualification, is a privilege reserved for white people. And I wrote that line really thinking about the history of foreign correspondence being something that has been overwhelmingly white, and until recently also overwhelmingly male, but also a history which is quite intertwined with the European colonization of the global South, and this idea that the natives can't be trusted to accurately convey what's happening around them. And that the sort of information about the global South is something to be extracted from these places to be consumed by those in the colonial center. And I think there's a pervasive and usually subconscious belief by audiences, as well as some of those in the media, that when it comes to countries like Myanmar, outsiders are vital in providing objective and neutral news. But when we step back to look at who gets labeled objective and neutral, it's almost always Western journalists, right? Like, no one's calling up Myanmar journalists to cover what's happening in Israel-Palestine, for example, despite the fact that Israel and Myanmar have both been credibly accused of engaging in ethnic cleansing by human rights organizations. The two countries do a lot of defense cooperation. Ethno-religious nationalism plays a really big role in the politics of both nations. And a Myanmar journalist might be able to offer some very interesting insights, given the similarities in the sort of experiences of minoritized people that are being harmed. And yet, the sort of people who get called up often look quite similar to one another. Then here's another caveat to say that, I don't think that all foreign correspondents, white or otherwise, can't bring value. I personally have learned quite a lot from the foreign correspondents that I've worked with. And I think what really stands out in those relationships for me is the humility and openness with which we both approach this partnerships. We saw each other as partners who brought valuable, if different expertise to the table that improved upon the story as a whole. And I think also that foreign correspondence can be a huge resource to countries like Myanmar, where the press was suppressed and persecuted for decades. We had official censors, state censors, pre-publication censorship before the country began to open up again in 2010. And so there's a generation gap where there simply aren't many veteran journalists, Myanmar journalists, who are able to train and teach and mentor a new generation. And, and foreign correspondents can bring a lot of that value. And, the value that they're bringing in that case is not, it's not foreignness, right? It's expertise. And I think, we see some really great models of this in Myanmar right now. Someone that comes to mind for me is Emily Fishbein. She has been covering Myanmar for years. She does really amazing work at a number of different outlets, and she's always constantly partnering with young Myanmar journalists. And you see people who work with her growing into confident young correspondents themselves. And you see her really working to help improve the skills of those she's working with, and not simply treat people as sort of fixers, which is something that's unfortunately quite common in Southeast Asia, where someone might be a fixer for years and they never sort of become a journalist. And that's not something that either they or the people that they're working with really strive to build for that individual. So yeah, I think, we see these models like what Emily has done, where she is simultaneously a mentor and an interlocutor and a student, where her and her local colleagues are learning from one another. And this results in extremely well-told stories that inform audiences of multiple types of audiences, right? Not just necessarily those who are reading sort of English language newspapers or international outlets, but also those in Myanmar. And it, is both reporting that educates the world, but also improves the field of journalism in Myanmar and strengthens the journalism field in Myanmar. And I think, after the CNN incident, this became even more stark to me when, I tweeted some things which sort of critiqued the trip, and I had a short exchange with Clarissa Ward in the RDMs, and she said something that really struck me, which was that, she told me that her report won't teach me anything I don't know because I'm living through it, but she hoped that it would make others aware of what was happening. And, I think there can be really great value in an outlet like CNN covering what's happening in Myanmar, as opposed to kind of, like local Myanmar outlets. Like, obviously that would increase the awareness of what's happening. But at the same time, I think it's concerning that she did not see her story as needing to be useful to the people of Myanmar. And that the experiences of the Myanmar people in that case really became the object of the story, and the subject became, the Western audience who could learn about this object, and the sort of brave journalists who entered Myanmar to get the scoop, as opposed to, the stories of the people who the story is supposed to be covering. And I think in this case, we can see that, as opposed to sort of just foreign correspondence in general, parachute journalism is this extremely extractive process. And it becomes, in a lot of ways, a spectacle that serves the desire of the individual journalist and the outlets that they work for, rather than working mainly to inform the public. Yeah, and so I think, there's a lot to be done to improve this. I don't think we should throw out foreign correspondents. I think they have a role to serve still. And I think, change is going to take a while. But, I think some things I would recommend that we start looking at, start talking about is, or the first thing would be to start saying no. I mean, this is much easier to say than do. I think especially for younger people who are earlier in their fields, especially women, especially sort of people who are already underrepresented. But, I think we need to have the moral clarity to turn down these opportunities sometimes. and advocate for better qualified people to take our places in some of these instances. I think another thing that can be do, which again is much easier said than done, is to call out individuals and institutions who engage in this kind of practice. And again, if you're young, if you're freelancing, if you're not as established, I understand that this could be potentially career suicide. And I'm very privileged, I think, in making this recommendation, in that I'm not very concerned about continuing in the field of journalism. This was kind of an accidental career for me. And, I would not be devastated if I had to change careers. But at the same time, like, change doesn't happen unless we start taking these sorts of risks. And the last one, I think, would be easier. But, I think we need to really rethink the situation of fixers. I see fixers all the time who are contacting sources. They're providing really important background information. They're translating and transcribing interviews. They're fact checking. They're basically doing everything but writing copy. And some of these people are fixing for years, for basically every correspondent who comes through a country. And yet, they're always relegated to this lesser role. But I really think at a certain point, these people they're journalists, they're doing journalism, and they deserve reporting credits and equitable pay. And I think that's something that, those of us who are sort of not locally based somewhere, or who use or hire these sorts of individuals, we really need to start advocating for them as journalists, and really try to expand what we consider to be valuable work in reporting that deserves to be paid and recognized.
Thank you. I almost feel like giving you a standing ovation for the last point. It's absolutely, fixers are essentially journalists on the ground doing the work with the expertise and local knowledge and shouldering the risk for a fraction of the pay of the rest of the foreign correspondents. There's a huge amount to unpick there, and I'd be really interested to know the thoughts from the audience, especially those from the countries where the local reporters have experienced conditions that you describe. I want to start by saying how much this resonates. I was born in Sri Lanka, which is another country that's had a media sector utterly decimated by its government, kind of dismantled through a kind of combination of legislation and arrests and disappearances, which makes journalism kind of incredibly financially precarious and dangerous. And then also being told repeatedly that Sri Lankans who want to report can't be objective about the ongoing civil war there. And yet the story is not interesting enough for much of it, for much of the duration for the international media to cover. And when they do cover it, it's when it's too late, really. It's when there's a massacre happening, and when there's nothing to be done except watch a massacre unfold and cover the aftermath. So I feel very strongly about what you said, and I think it's very true. You talk really about the idea of who's the news for, and I thought it's very interesting that the Clarissa Ward said, I'm telling a story to people who, I'm not telling the story to you because you know everything, I'm telling a story to people who are not, who might not know about what's happening in Myanmar. And I think there's an idea of the default viewer or the default audience, which is often the richest, most urban person in the spectrum. And so internationally, you're absolutely right. It's often the Western countries, it's Europe and American viewers. Even on a local level, you talk about reporting it from Britain going out to the regions and reporting on the regions as if they were somehow othered. And the idea is that the people in the center, in the capital, are the people who need to be, who the information needs to be packaged for. I'd like to know, you've talked a little bit about what you'd like to see, which is a combination of foreign correspondents who've built up expertise over a number of years, combined with local reporters presenting the news for media houses. Can you talk a little bit about this, especially during the 2019 Rohingya crisis and your reporting there? What you felt worked and what you would change in hindsight over the kind of stories that were done at the time?
Yeah, I think, there were some very interesting cases that have popped up in the Myanmar context where foreign correspondence ended in like very strange disasters. So this isn't really Rohingya crisis, but um, there's a pervasive myth that the Myanmar language does not have a word for vagina. And this was due to a mistranslation or like of some bizarre misunderstanding where the interviewee had said something along the lines of, in my house, there was no word for this, meaning that, they didn't talk about it in her house because the most common Burmese swear word is the C word. And so had this correspondent talked to a single Burmese person, really, who was also, just like living there and like spoke English well enough, or spoke whatever language this correspondent spoke well enough to cover the story, this myth wouldn't have started. And it's something that's quoted quite often, actually, and taken as fact when people write about gender in Myanmar. And there's many, many issues of gender inequality in Myanmar, but this is a non-issue, and it's very strange that this has become the sort of like go-to, like, look how bad it is in this country line. Yeah, and I think, you see similar things with the Rohingya crisis, where oftentimes you see foreign correspondents kind of playing into this kind of discursive trap where, because they don't understand the sort of conspiracy theories that are occurring in Myanmar, because they don't have a deep understanding of the discourse that's happening in Myanmar around nationalism, around sovereignty, they have presented this very black and white narrative about who the racists in Myanmar are and what they want. The violence is very black and white, right? But this presentation of, why Myanmar people feel the way they do about the Rohingya, I think has gotten this very sort of flat representation. And, having more local knowledge in those cases would have been very helpful. But then, at the same time, like, having foreign correspondents in the country can be something, working with a foreign correspondent can be something that's extremely helpful because of racial dynamics, power dynamics, right? Like, when I was paired up with an older white man to do an article, people just treated me like I was some victim who was forced to translate for this man. And they would just like tell me secrets on the side, despite me having introduced myself as a journalist, as his partner. And kind of, they're being wary of him, but they'll tell me something. Or, in certain cases, we can sort of play up some of these roles and expectations in order to get people to either let their guard down or, build a rapport in a way that might not have been possible without that partnership. And then there's also, of course, the safety issue, right? Like, sometimes you don't put your name on something, but it's good to have someone's name on it, right? It builds trust with the public, it builds accountability, and having someone whose life would not be destroyed if they were banned from a country work on a story with you, to be able to say the difficult things, to take responsibility for those things, can be extremely helpful. So yeah, I think, what is not done well is a situation in which people treat local journalists and fixers, whatever we want to call people, as sort of tools to get to a story, as opposed to sort of an equal partner who has different expertise than you.
How much do you think the idea of parachute journalism, so like you said, very different from being a foreign correspondent and staying on the ground, but someone coming in for a short period of time and leaving, how much of that is driven by this idea that this is the most objective way to tell the story, which is the justification given, and how much do you think is pure economics, that it's actually just too expensive to maintain a bureau and staff in the region, so it's easier to have one person who flies in and out of hotspots?
Yeah, I think it makes sense economically. If your paper is focused on, like, it would be very strange for like The Economist, the US outlet, to have a bureau in each Southeast Asian country, right? Like, they don't generally care that much about Southeast Asia. They don't have that much coverage. It makes sense to have one person who lives here who, tries as much as they can to be a regional expert, or, to uh, have accept submissions from freelancers, right? Like you don't necessarily need to have one person who is tasked with what is really an overwhelming responsibility of being, like, if we're thinking about Southeast Asia, one of the most diverse regions of the world. 1 in 6 people on Earth are Southeast Asian. Um, Myanmar alone speaks over 100 languages and dialects. Uh, and that's one country, and it's quite small, and no one talks about it that much. So yeah, I mean, I think the economic argument, has some sway. I think and it's sort of just like one of the hard realities of a dying industry that we're all in. But I think the more dangerous narrative would be the sort of objectivity argument of like, I will not ever accept that argument that someone who knows less about something is necessarily more objective. Um, and I also I don't necessarily completely buy into this concept of objectivity in news anyway. I think if you know enough about something, you should either have an opinion on it, or like if you say you don't have an opinion on it, like, I don't know if you're stupid or you're lying, but if you've like spent 3 months on something, you should have an opinion. And that's different from reporting on something fairly. It's different from making sure that everyone who's in your story has, the ability to respond, and, has their voice heard, and has their perspective represented. But yeah, like, I don't think it's necessarily helpful for journalism for us to pretend that there is this sort of absolute truth that can be accessed if we're just perfect enough in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's strange to think the absolute truth can be found most quickly from a point of no knowledge. That seems kind of weird journey to me. And also coming with no expertise does not mean you're objective. It means you're kind of vulnerable to buying the first line that's fed to you, essentially. You've got no way of assessing the quality of the information that's being put to you as well. I'm going to go to some of our questions from some of our journalist fellows who are from various parts of the world, starting with Rachel Chitra from India. Because we talked about the economics of not being able to maintain a foreign bureau, but the CNN, it's a wealthy organization that could afford this, and certainly a lot of the large American organizations could. So she's asking the question, framing in terms of discrimination. So media houses have been, got into trouble for sex discrimination, age discrimination. So could there be a way of saying you're going to get into trouble for inherent bias in hiring foreign correspondents? So when you see job adverts from the BBC, the New York Times, clearly stating they want someone with prior foreign correspondent experience, it kind of means you need a foreign passport holder, which means often that you are white or certainly not native. Could this be seen as discrimination in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's tricky in that, the economic argument is often seen as a valid reason for discrimination, right? Like, if you have a correspondent who is, Pakistani, for example, and has a Pakistani passport, it's just so much harder to have them be a foreign correspondent and to sort of like invest the sort of money, but also potentially risk them not being able to get a visa or enter a country fast enough to cover something, which then loses your organization money. And I think we would have clearly it's discrimination based on something this imaginary correspondent would have no control over. But at the same time, I don't know and I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but, I imagine it would be difficult to prove that this was sort of discrimination based on like inalienable, unchangeable characteristics, as opposed to kind of like the hard, like economic and like legal realities. Yeah, and I mean, the sort of, and the same goes for things like having prior experience. I think there are, in all sorts of employment, there are all of these things that kind of gently weed out certain classes of people. So like, degrees, years of experience, right? Like internships. that go along class and race and economic lines and all sorts of things. And again, it's very difficult to prove. It's very difficult to make stick. And yeah, I would love for it to be successful, but I don't know if we live in a current sort of legal framework in which these would be cases that would be worth pursuing, especially because whoever pursues these cases, it would probably be made quite public, and I don't know if they would have a career afterwards.
Also, news organizations do also have to work with kind of Home Office, State Department laws over immigration and the right to work, and proving that there's nobody in the country who could realistically do the job. So, which is why you'd have to give it to foreign passport holders. So it is kind of hard to overcome. But thank you. A very good question from Kantaro Komiya, looking at where foreign correspondents come and they want to bring up the case of Yuki Kitazumi, who's the Japanese journalist who was recently freed from detention in Yangon after Japanese officials had background talks with the junta. He's not a kind of one-off foreign parachute correspondent. He was a kind of correspondent at Nikkei, and he's not a white celebrity reporter, though he is from a privileged, relatively wealthy country, Japan. And you can't detach Japan from its historical imperialism and economic hegemony over Southeast Asia in particular. And on the Clarissa Ward issue, Kitatsumi told Vice's Heather Chen that he was not personally offended by the CNN coverage, and which I thought was a kind of interesting point, because it's like, well, yes, it wasn't, he wouldn't be personally offended because he's not from Myanmar, but he's also not white. So what would be your take of this kind of nuanced dynamics within the Asian non-white journalism community?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of saying that they're not offended by the coverage, I mean, I'm not offended by the coverage either. The story wasn't awful. It was fine, right? Like, it was fine. My problem is 11 people got arrested, right? And like, for what? I mean, hopefully I don't ever end up in a situation where someone who speaks to me gets arrested. And I do try my absolute best to try and ensure that at all times. But if 11 people are going to get arrested, I hope I got something amazing out of it, right? Like something like just absolutely earth-shattering. And, we got shots of a market, right? Like it's never worth it for someone to be subject to the sort of violence that the military is subjecting people to in prisons right now. But like, the story was not worth it. And I think that's kind of what offends me. But yeah, I think in terms of sort of the general for correspondence in Myanmar, I will say that Myanmar generally has, I would say, higher quality foreigners than a lot of Southeast Asia. Myanmar is a very difficult place to live. Yangon is one of the most expensive cities to live in Southeast Asia. You can pay $2,000 a month for like a 1-bedroom apartment, and you cannot drink the tap water. There will definitely be many cockroaches. You will be constantly experiencing blackouts, right? Like, for the money that people are spending, like, people get electrocuted every year in like downtown Myanmar during the rainy seasons because like the wires fall down. It's not a particularly safe place. It's not a particularly comfortable place. And I do think that the people who are living and working in Myanmar, who are not Myanmar citizens, generally are quite committed to the country. And in the case of Kitazumi-san, he's been there forever. So I think, it's just such a different class of people versus someone like a sort of like professional parachute journalist whose job it is to hop from country to country to country and never really develop that kind of deeper knowledge and connections that would help them, as you said earlier, kind of digest information that they're given and be able to parse through what the information they're given might mean and the role they might play in the larger narrative.
Talk a little bit about kind of coverage and portrayal of countries, because Myanmar was underreported for a very long time, and the coverage that did exist focused on Aung San Suu Kyi in particular. And there does seem to be a trend of being able to cover countries when there is a personality to focus on, and this could be Robert Mugabe, it could be Imelda Marcos, it could, but it, you know, when you have a strong-willed individual who speaks good English in different ways and has a personality and something to latch onto in a way, whether it's personality trait or a particular vice or a particular life story, that seems to be that seems to then result in their country and their situation getting wider coverage internationally. Do you think this is something that's inevitable, or is there a different way of telling these stories than through these big, kind of big individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the question of who is the audience and why are we telling these stories, right? Like, if the goal of Myanmar coverage is to raise awareness so that the audiences in the non-Myanmar countries will pressure the governments to do something or boycott, then yeah, like I think having a strong personality, a strong narrative can be extremely helpful in motivating people to commit to an action. You know, like it is like when one of the earlier deaths happened in Myanmar, and it was this, you know, young woman who was a singer who did martial arts, who was wearing that shirt that said everything will be okay. And like, there were just so many pictures of her because she was sort of such an attention-grabbing person at protests, right? Like that galvanized the country, right? We're not talking about an international audience, we're talking about the people in Myanmar. And it was sort of telling her story was much more effective at moving people than telling people, you know, 18 people were killed today. Here are all of their names in a big list that you're not going to remember. But at the same time, you know, there's a danger to it. And I think we saw that very clearly in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, where, you know, she was built up as this sort of very liberal, progressive, moral leader who, you know, not only had the mandate of the country, but also the sort of expertise that should be trusted in terms of where she was leading the country. And people kind of ignored like the multiple books she wrote, where, you know, she talks about nationalism, she talks about her love for the army, and a lot of the things, you know, if you kind of read the things she herself had written, or, you know, the way in which she was being talked about by other activists in the country who, you know, were aligned with her in terms of not wanting a dictatorship and didn't necessarily agree with her party and didn't join her party, you know, we might have gotten a much more complex vision of this woman, and the world might not have been quite so shocked when Myanmar kind of began to veer off in the direction it did after her party won election.
Yeah. I'm going back to this idea of who's the journalism for. A question from Jenny in Finland. Do you think part of the problem is that often the US outlets who do the most visible are the ones that do the most visible foreign coverage, and that this kind of American perspective, because they're writing for their own audience, becomes the dominant truth all over the world? And so the problem would be solved to some extent by making foreign correspondence better in the English-speaking Western world, so you get other perspectives as well that become a kind of truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think media, like news media right now, is having a crisis in general, where news is becoming like much more nationalized and much more sort of international from a very specific perspective. You know, I think there's great value in sort of like your town newspaper and that existing and having funding and being able to cover stories that, you know, like the next town over wouldn't care about, but like if your mayor is like abusing teenage girls, right, like that should be a story. And like maybe that's not, like, your neighbors in the town over wouldn't care about it, but it's really important to cover that. Yeah, so I think sort of this US domination is very problematic, especially because all of us, you know, regardless of how much we try, we will be biased, and we will have been, to a certain extent, indoctrinated with certain, you know, quote unquote truths about the world. And, you know, the US has this very specific perspective. And not only because like US news is also just like really reliant on like ad money. But also just because, like like everyone went to school in like the same curriculum that like taught them like, communism is the greatest evil that the US needs to defeat. And, like these the sort of like things that are considered to be true and unquestionable in America. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily just a question of making individual foreign correspondence better. I think that would help, obviously, but I think it's also a question of diversifying who gets to be a foreign correspondent and where the pool of talent that people are looking at comes from.
Where does this conversation start? This is two questions from Markolu in Kenya and then also from Christina Francisca in Indonesia. Mark's asking, how do you get large media houses to trust local reporters with the big local stories? Like, where does this conversation have to begin? And then the question Christina was asking is, well, what do fixers on the ground, what can they do? Because there's such a power imbalance. No local media can pay the journalists on the ground as well as the foreign media can. And it's very hard for the fixers to ask for a byline when they just have no power to negotiate. So how do you persuade your kind of employers to give you these bylines?
Yeah, I think in terms of the sort of power imbalance, like we as like those of us who are reporters, those of us who are sort of like contractually tied to an organization, like we need to be the ones advocating for fixers. I think, if this is what they want, obviously, some people might not want that. We should be there as their advocates. And that might be hard. It might suck. It might not work for months and months and months. But I think, just getting that idea to be much more normalized is important and will eventually lead to change, whether that is, eventually like you get a new editor or just institutions just start getting used to this idea that, fixers are reporters if they're going beyond, a few set tasks. Yeah, and then I think in terms of, I think we can also improve the way in which we work with fixers. Like if the individuals are interested, I think it's always valuable to explain to people why you're doing what you're doing and kind of like get them to engage with the story in a way that is sort of more involved. And then I forgot what the first part of the question was.
How do you explain to how do you convince the large media houses themselves, in their headquarters, that the local reporters can be trusted with the story and can be trusted to report the truth, as you put it?
Yeah, that's hard. I think especially because people tend to hold like access to editors a bit close to the chest. I mean, obviously there is sort of just personal incentive of if someone else is talking to them, they might not take your story. But yeah, I think a lot of this is unfortunately just like slow cultural change where you just argue with people until they eventually get tired of you and give you what you want.
Yeah, I think it's a wider question, a kind of conversation that needs to happen in newsrooms about objectivity and who owns the concept of objectivity, and asking senior editors to question their norms around that would be a start. The kind of flip side of this is the kind of class of young parachutists. This is a question from Jonathan Crone. There is a whole class called young parachutists. So you're freelancers who hop from place to place with the occasional grant or the occasional magazine commission. And this breeds this. I've seen this a lot, and this is another lifestyle. It's kind of different lifestyle, and it breeds a certain type of online echo chamber. There are kind of private journalism message boards and expat communities that reward and promote this work, and kind of group of people who know how to find the commissions, how to find the grants, and gain these kind of stories. And there's two downsides to this. Firstly, it results in the kind of parachute journalism that you describe, but it's also often dangerous for these young correspondents who go into this area without the proper hostile environment training, without the right equipment, without the backing of a newsroom. And when they then get into trouble, they're in tremendous personal danger and often endanger the people around them as well, and often a set of diplomatic incidents which have kind of ongoing repercussions. So how do you counter this kind of romanticization of this parachute lifestyle? Is there an alternative to this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily know if this is a problem particular to journalism. I think as travel has gotten more accessible, especially, there's just, a class of young people who want to live this sort of like glamorous international lifestyle, and they're kind of willing to do whatever to access that, right? Like you see like backpackers in Southeast Asia, I'm sure in other places as well, but these kind of people who kind of just like travel around and like, they might do like a street act or just like straight up ask for money from locals in order to continue their adventure. You see a lot of this like work stay vacation type stuff, where people volunteer hours or kind of work for free in order to get free housing and accommodations. And I think an earlier version of this that's still ongoing would be kind of people who join like the Peace Corps, and with an eye towards travel, right? And as opposed to sort of being purely about service. So I don't know if there's much to be done specifically within journalism, and that this is more of a broader cultural issue where people see the global South as a place that simultaneously needs to be saved, like by them in particular somehow, but also as this sort of like disappearing treasure that they need to be able to witness because it'll never be the same again, because it's industrializing, because all the quaintness and the charm is going away. Yeah, so I think the romanticization is happening before people ever become journalists, and journalism kind of just becomes a conduit for some people to access that dream.
I used to work for AP in their London bureau, and it was funny being from Britain and seeing Britain being turned into this romanticized, cute Britain stories for the American audience. And staying on this from Bermet Talant in Kyrgyzstan, who's again one of our journalist fellows, you talk about who gets to tell the story, and do you think there's a big imbalance and bias in what kind of stories are told? So journalists who complain that the Western media ask for a US angle or a European angle, or for the kind of extra violent or the kind of extra drama, and aren't interested in the nuance.
Yeah, definitely. So, just in terms of what's happening in Myanmar right now, I've done a number of television interviews for Western outlets about, the sort of latest update on what's happening in Myanmar. But almost without fail, they'll ask me, what is the latest with the updates? What is the latest with the street protests? And, I always try to answer that question by turning it around, and saying like they're ongoing. Like, I understand that they look sexy on camera, but, the real change that's happening is happening amongst the shadow government. It's happening amongst the ethnic army organizations, like people who are not on camera, people who like kind of boring stuff to talk about in a minute on television. And, but people keep wanting to know about, have people been shot in the streets? Are their bodies being returned? And yeah, there's this sort of like desire for spectacle in the news when it comes to countries where people already expect violence.
Yeah.
Whereas if there's endless articles about like President Trump, former President Trump's like cabinet intrigue. And yet, you would never hear a story about Myanmar in these sort of like big international outlets about like what is happening in the national unity government and like what personalities are clashing.
And yet kind of with infographics, with the data, with the visuals we can do, there's huge opportunities to tell these nuanced stories in quite catching ways. You don't need the visual of people dying on the street to grab attention. So absolutely, it's a missed opportunity. Can I talk, so we can run out of time. I do just want to talk a little bit about Frontier and Danny Fenster, and in particular, what can be usefully done by the international community right now, and especially by the international journalism community to help journalists in Myanmar?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking about Frontier specifically, people can become a member of Frontier. They have different packages, including sort of like daily email updates, if that's what you're into. And they also accept donations. Frontier, I mean, like very few news opportunities in Myanmar are profitable, but Frontier, is not swimming in cash even now, especially now, I guess. And having someone in jail in Myanmar can get quite expensive. They don't get, like, people are not well fed. You need to send people food, you need to send people medicine, you have to hire lawyers, right? Like there's all of this stuff. I think if we're speaking broadly, talk to your governments, help pressure them to pressure the Myanmar government or the military junta to release the people who have been unjustly detained. The possibility is much higher for foreign nationals that these countries would be much more willing to put levy diplomatic pressure to get their citizens back. So don't kind of let them off the hook when they're not successful, because like Japan has shown that it can be successful, right? Like there is a way. And then also pressure your governments to be ready to accept refugees, essentially, to help journalists who need to leave, which is basically all journalists at this point. And just like Myanmar, dissidents from Myanmar in general, who, should they try to leave, will need asylum, who are in a situation where every country Myanmar borders is not exactly friendly to refugees, where people who are working in exile from India, from Thailand. I mean, no one's really going to China to work as a journalist in exile. But should they go, they're in extremely precarious situations, and a third country resettlement would not only allow them to continue their work, but also would help them ensure that these other countries are not sort of rounding them up and sending them back, should the junta kind of try to demand that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Final question from me. Are you concerned about the junta manipulating foreign journalists coming into the country in terms of controlling their access, or do you think this is, or foreign correspondents, or do you think this is something that kind of the foreign correspondents, are able to navigate their way through?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of Myanmar, the foreign correspondents who have kind of been focusing on Myanmar, or at least have had experience. This is not a new situation, right? Like the Myanmar military has done guided tours into Rakhine State after the Rohingya crisis. They've done sort of guided tours into Myanmar in the past in general. And there's just like many places where people aren't allowed to go. So, people aren't, this isn't a new situation for people. And then on top of which, Myanmar is in a very different situation than it was in during the 2007 uprising or the 1988 uprising, where despite the internet shutdowns and all this stuff, there's just so many more ways to communicate with the average person in Myanmar, as well as this sort of like much more robust class of civil society and activists, NGO workers, people who just have more access to communicate out. That I don't think that's necessarily sort of one of the main risks that we're looking at right now.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, and you're doing incredible work, and I hope you all do stay safe. And like I said, we'll do what we can to keep the attention on you and your journalism. And we've put out links to Frontier as well in our chat, so do kind of look at those and follow through. Next week, we're going to stay on this topic of covering the global story, and we're going to Ethiopia to Samuel Getachew, a journalist based in Addis Ababa, who's written for Quartz, the CNN, Huffington Post, Globe and Mail. The Ethiopian general elections are coming up on June the 5th, and he'll be talking to us about the situation in Tigray, the ban on foreign journalists, and the reporting again of massacres in a country that again has featured in the Western press highly in terms of war and famine, and yet it's one of the most fascinating, beautiful, and intellectually demanding countries I've ever visited. Thank you so much for your time today and for your thoughts and for your insight as well. And thank you all for the questions. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.